Welcome to Listening with China Blue. This is a podcast that focuses on how listening not only informs us about what is occurring in the world around us, but also helps us connect with others, build stronger businesses, strengthens our mental health, and become more creative and compassionate individuals. As more and more people practice attentive listening in a community, it becomes a community building practice that strengthens our mental health as we learn from our neighbors. I will be interviewing people from all walks of life to learn how listening has informed them in their field and helped them to make intelligent decisions. They will be artists, musicians, composers, dancers, business people, psychologists, neuroscientists, and Buddhists, to name a few. About me, I'm an internationally exhibiting sound-based artist. In my work, Discovering Unheard Sounds, I realized that the core component that drove my work was simply listening. That realization put me on the path of speaking about and helping people learn to become better listeners. I began with leading sound walks, which I continue to do in the upstate New York region to help people learn to listen from nature. And now, tune your ears to this podcast to learn about the power of listening. And do pay attention until the end for further information on how to start your own listening practice, share it with others, and to support Listening with China Blue. In this episode, I interview Mia Lobel. Mia is a veteran audio producer, manager, and educator who has spent her career championing creativity, diversity, and character-driven storytelling. She has worked with the best writers, journalists, and intellectuals to help them achieve their vision in sound. She was the managing producer and lead producer for Malcolm Gladwell's Revisionist History. As VP of Content and Production for his Pushkin Industries company, she oversaw the creation of 28 podcasts. She says that she believes that happy people do great work, and she leads by creating a culture of kindness. She also recommends that you should always take a podcast out for a walk. Welcome, Mia.
Hi, China Blue.
Good morning, Mia.
Good morning.
Given your long history in audio, I thought we would start at the beginning to give the audience a reference point. My question is, how did you get into audio and why was it so transformative?
Yeah, well, I like to tell this story about when I was in college. I wasn't like an NPR baby, like a backseat NPR listener. That wasn't my dad only ever listened to classical music and the Beatles. And so I was not one of those, you know, I didn't have NPR on my radar when I got to college, but I was into music. I did love music and I loved theater. And I got to college and I took this class called The Meaning of Memory.
Hmm.
And it was basically a class all about the Holocaust. And my grandparents were Holocaust survivors. And so I decided for the final paper for this class that I was going to interview them about their experience. And I was just going to do an oral history, just to learn about their lives from beginning to end. Or beginning to where we were then when they were in their, I'm trying to think, 70s or 80s, I'm not sure. And I was not a very fast note taker. I really was much more of a listener. I was just better at that. I had really messy handwriting. I'm a lefty, so my writing was just all over the place. And so I decided that instead of trying to furiously take notes to get it all down, I would record them. And I bought this tiny little mini cassette recorder, this crappy cheap thing that I got at Radio Shack or something. And I put it down on the table in front of us and I did my interview and I just listened to them talk. Then I had to go back and transcribe these interviews. And what I realized is that when I was listening back to the tapes, there was something about hearing their voices played back to me after the fact when I didn't have to be actively listening, when I was just sort of taking down the words. It hit me in this wholly new way. And I was really moved by it. I was really, the sound of their laughter and the sound of there was laughter to even telling stories about the Holocaust. And the sound of there wasn't crying, but there was emotion, and that really, it just really stayed with me. And when I came back, and I sort of left it there. When I went to grad school for journalism, I thought I was going to be a photojournalist. But when we had this required class, sort of introduction to audio class. And when I took that class, I was sort of brought back to that tape and to that experience. And it just sort of occurred to me that I could do that, that I could tell stories with in that way, with sound only. The challenge of not having the visuals there, as a photographer, I was like, what would happen if you took away the visuals? And that sort of hooked me in a whole new way. So that was sort of the start of my, radio slash audio career. And I've kind of been doing it ever since. So it's been a long time.
Oh, what a fascinating beginning. I love it. And I know that when we spoke about this offline, you had said to me that it was transformative. And I love this statement that you made. Is that because of the power of the human voice, it can change you. It is about how it carries humor, emotion, humanity, as well as information.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, in journalism, it's so much about passing along the facts, right? You want to
Oh, sure.
get journalism, you want to get information to the people, right? But when you do audio storytelling, there's a lot more to it than that. It's really, bringing people along on a journey, and that includes ups and downs and highs and lows and all these things that can be transferred through sound, which I think is so amazing.
Yeah, and given your long history of storytelling with audio, you had we were also speaking about the fact that you had mentioned that listening can occur on different levels, and wanted to talk to you about your way of thinking about listening.
Yeah, I mean, I have to listen, I listen for my work, right? Like that is my actual job. And there are so many different aspects of that depending on what part of my job I'm doing. So, you know, in the beginning of a storytelling stage, I'm often listening to fully recorded conversations, just to like raw conversations, just to see what jumps out. What are the best moments? What are the golden nuggets is one of the terms. I think Ira Glass came up with that. Um, just really sort of broad strokes, interesting moments. So I'm listening for that. In other kinds of listens, like at the tail end of a project, I'm listening for any kind of bad edit. It's a more technical listen. I'm listening just to see, like, okay, is the volume right? Is it all fluid? Does it just sound good to the ear? Like, kind of, are there any digital artifacts or things that we need to fix? Um, and then there's listening for the story, right? Then there's and it's interesting because I think it's sort of a more active way of listening and a more passive way of listening, where you just let a story wash over you and you're not really listening hard. You're not like looking for something in particular, but you're taking it in a much deeper way. It's affecting. If a story is working, it's going to really affect you in this much deeper way, and sort of depending on what part of my job I'm doing. And that's how I listen when I'm like doing a story edit, for example. If I'm just letting a story kind of wash over me and see, like, okay, does the structure of this story work? Um, are there moments where I'm drifting and not paying attention anymore? Are there moments where I'm really completely invested in this? And what changes do I need to make to help make this story go better? So really, like, there's so many. I mean, that was four different types of listening, I think. There's probably more if I thought about it, but those are sort of the first ones that come to mind.
Right, right, and each one you can delve into in depth, I'm sure. Um, but what was coming to my mind was the fact that also, after you do all of that, you review all the material, you think about it from listening from all these different vantage points, but then also you as a producer come back and supplement it with additional audio, like music, for example. Can you tell me a little bit about your process doing that?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a little while since I've gotten to do that type of work, but it's really some of my favorite work to do. I'm not a composer myself. I used to play piano and clarinet and I sing, but I'm not I don't make music on my own. But I love to take other people's music and manipulate it for the purposes of story. And I had this amazing collaboration with an incredible composer named Luis Guerra, who's out in Los Angeles, and he did all the music for Revisionist History, which is the show that I um, uh, helped develop with Malcolm Gladwell. And music was a really big part of that. And because we were telling historical stories that didn't necessarily have, um, we didn't have tape for everything. If you're going to try to make the sound of, I don't know, I'm not going to be able to come up with an example off the top of my head, but we had to try to make these historical moments come to life, and we didn't always have tape to do that. Sometimes we would have archival tape, but sometimes we didn't. And so I would go to Luis and I would say, okay, I need the sound of a 1970s basketball game, but not the actual sound, like just the mood of it, right? And he would kind of go off and compose something and hand it back to me, and then I would get to take it and manipulate it, make it longer or shorter, looping the beats and things like that. And I'm not even, I was just figuring this out as I go. I don't have any specific training in this, but I was able to add this layer of scoring to our episodes, and it was so much fun. And it was really like you have to listen to both the content of the story, right, like where and when and who, and also the rhythm of the speaking, the rhythm of the tape, and then the mood that you want to evoke, and kind of make choices about the music based on that, and the emotion that you want to attach to the story at that point. And it was just so much fun, and we had so many different types of stories that I was able to, and I did this for about 7 seasons, 10 episodes a season, so 70 different times, 70 different
Oh,
stories. I got to play with music in this way. Um and and we I would probably use I he Luis would make me about 5 original themes, we would call them, for each episode, in a certain mood, but using different rhythms, different instrumentation, stuff like that. And so so I don't know, do the math. It's a lot. It was a lot of music that I got to play
sure.
with. And it was really fun, and I think it worked. People really responded to that show, especially in the early days, and they still are. But it was pretty unique at the time that we were doing it. The show came out in 2016. So this was like early podcast days, and it had a different sound than a lot of other shows that were out there at that time. And I think a lot of that was because of Luis's music, and in part because of the way that we used it in the show.
Oh, wow. That's so amazing. I was thinking about how, when you were talking about your whole process, how listening drove your creativity in a very broad stroke of putting that, because you bear down on all the particular details of how it helped you, and how it inspired you too.
Well, and what I would do, you're reminding me, what I would do is I was very familiar with the story without the music before I had the music in hand. So Malcolm would be doing his reporting and his writing, and we would have gone through the scripts a bunch of times. And by the time it came to scoring, I really knew it. I knew the story. I knew all the characters. I knew exactly what was there. So Luis would give me his themes for that episode, and I would sometimes pull into old themes, especially in later seasons. I would sort of like just go through, and I would just listen to the music without the story. And I would be like, okay, what moment does this? I would do this little matching game in my head. Like, what moment do I think this would work with? Or what instrument is this character really calling for? And I would and then I would drop the music to the episode, and I would kind of listen to it, and then I would move it forward and backward, and I would start to change the length of it, and it would kind of come together in this very organic way. And I was often doing this in the middle of the night because I needed quiet, and I didn't have a lot of quiet. And so it was this really intense and fun experience, about really like listening to the music and feeling it, and then putting it together it was always with characters. I really connected the music with certain characters more so than scenes. And then that character, whenever that character would come back, that same theme would come back. Um, yeah, and
Oh,
even today, if I hear like one of the themes, I can connect it to that. I have that character like comes up in my head.
so in a way, it sort of, do you see it as a backdrop or an augmentation to the character? How does it engage with the character?
Well, it has to be subtle, right? Because the
Right.
story needs to be front and center. But I don't think of it as background at all. I think of it as augmentation. I like that word, right? It's something that brings the character to life on another level. It tells you more about that character in the story. And these are true. This is all nonfiction. These are real people. They're not
Oh,
fictional
wow.
characters. These are real people. But I've sort of assigned them a mood and a theme and an instrument in my head and a pace. Well, their voice often dictates the pace, but it's definitely something that adds to their character for the purposes of the story.
It reminds this conversation is reminding me a lot of how, music is composed for film,
Mm.
and
Luis is a film composer, actually. This was the first, I think, one of the first
oh,
podcasts he had done. So it's very much like that. But I don't have any experience in film. I'd love to hear how it's similar.
well, if you when you're watching a film, listen to the soundtrack very attentively. I mean, besides the vocalization of the character, there's usually always music in the background. But as you will notice, when a new scene starts, this is more recently, about 1 or 2 or maybe 3 seconds before the scene, you'll hear the sound of the scene before it starts to sort of prime you for a change. And this changes, and then listen attentively to the soundtrack that goes underneath it and how it basically right now, it's designed to drive your emotions. So
It's so funny you mentioned that because I definitely think about that when working in audio, which I know so well, but I never think about it in film. I've never noticed it. I know it has an effect on me, but I never noticed it at that detail. And when I've done a lot of teaching, and there are people who kind of came up and took over revisionist history from me, an incredible team of other producers. And I would sort of talk about how the sound that is done the best is going to be invisible.
yeah,
It's going to have an impact on you, but listeners are not going to notice. You're going to put your blood, sweat, and tears into this, into every little detail of timing and pacing and all of that. But the listener's not going to notice. And it sounds like that's what you're describing in film, which is how it impacts me, is at this very sort of very subtle level that I would not have noticed in detail the way you just described it, but that's how I think about it in audio. So I'll have to pay more attention and see if I
sure,
can.
pay when next time you watch a film, pay attention, especially ones that, have emotional scenes where there's a car crash, which is this is so common nowadays. A car crash or some heightened emotional situation where people are in conflict, for example. You can listen if you would listen to the music, it's sort of slowly ramping up as the emotional content of the scene increases and increases and increases. And then there's some kind of explosion, and so that's paralleled with some kind of emotional drama in the audio part, and then there's the resolution, of course. So then the audio becomes a little bit more, um, it sort of massages the emotions in a sense.
Well,
Makes
and I
it
know you
go
can
down.
feel, I mean, I love to watch movies and TV, and I get so into it, and I'm sure that's working on, all that you're describing is working on you in this very deep level. But to be able to pick out the exact thing that's happening takes an amount of, skill, production skill, that in
Yeah, yeah,
film I
and
don't have.
and I think it's kind of interesting that you as an audio aficionado, uh is not paying attention to that, and in a way, that's great because you're allowing the film to have its full impact on you.
Well, and so this is another thing that I think about with working in audio only, is that like visuals are distracting. I like it. They take so much of your attention, like to the point where even as a sound person, I don't notice the soundtrack in a film or TV because I'm so absorbed in the visuals and what's happening. That's taking almost all of my attention. And in audio, you don't have that distraction.
Right.
So, so things work, the stories work on you in a whole different way. I mean, it's still true that if the sound is done well, you're not going to notice it. But if the sound is done poorly in audio, I mean, the piece is ruined. If you have poor quality sound in a story, it really stands out. It really, even if
Sure.
you don't notice what's wrong with it, it takes you out of the story in a really
Yeah.
um, dramatic way. And that's one of the things I love about it, is that there's nothing to hide behind. Um, and I like that about it. I think it's a good challenge.
Oh, yeah. Well, having that raw emotion is really wonderful. I've never thought it personally. I'm always trying to sort of hide behind my emotions and filter them a little bit so that they're not so dramatic in my conversations. And yet, the more I speak to people, especially in doing podcasts, the more I realize that, oh, wow, emotions are really important. People are not scared to hear them, and actually they respond to them, as opposed to trying to filter them or protect an audience from hearing something that's painful, for example.
Mhm, mhm.
So that's been my lesson. But speaking more about you, um, I I wanted to go back with you to the first time you worked, the beginning when you almost didn't work with Malcolm Gladwell, and you were telling me a story about how it was about not listening. Do you remember that story?
Um, I think, is this the story of when I first met him I'm trying to remember what I said. I
Oh, okay.
apologize.
About where he approached you to work for him and
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah. This, yes. Okay.
trying not to tell the story,
Right, right, right. Well, yeah, so when I first I didn't know him. I had been working on a show about foreign policy. I was executive producing a show about foreign policy, and it wasn't a great experience. The show was fine, but the I had kind of a bad boss in this situation, and I was, I left that, and I was starting to freelance again. And a friend of mine brought me in to meet with Malcolm Gladwell, and I didn't know him. I didn't know anything about him, and I just sort of, whatever. I had some ideas in my head about what he was going to be like, and what I had to do was they gave me an outline of revisionist history. This is in 2014, maybe 2015, and they asked me to come in for a meeting with him, and to talk about it. And what I saw in this outline was, it was all about cars, economics, sports, and like every person that he was suggesting he interview was a man. And I was like, no way, dude. Like, he's like, well, what do you think? And I was like, yeah, there's some really, I'm a positive person. I'm not mean. And this was I'm meeting a famous person. So I did this very nicely, but I basically said, here's what I see. And if you ever want women to listen to this podcast, you're going to have to make some changes. And here I was thinking, like, okay, that's it. I like wasn't going to have another bad boss. I felt like I had nothing to lose. And that's what I said to Malcolm Gladwell. And I was ready to kind of be escorted out the door. Like, thank you very much. Next. And that's not at all what happened. Malcolm kind of looked down at his script and kind of paused for a minute, and he looked back up at me and he was like, oh, you're right. And I was like, oh, wait, really? Oh, okay. Well, maybe we can work together here. And it really, and I really did believe that. I mean, I know there are plenty of women who are interested in cars and economics and, sports, of course, but it was so narrowly focused. And he was just thinking about, you know, in order to make a show that is going to be appealing to a broad audience, you do need to expand beyond that, and most especially in the guests that you bring on to
Sure.
talk to. And that started this really amazing relationship with him, where he really listened to me. I just didn't think that he would. I kind of was like, I'm a nobody. Like, why is Malcolm Gladwell going to listen to me? Um, but he really did. And he didn't always take my advice, certainly, but it sort of became this relationship where he would look to me to tell him the truth about what I felt about what he was doing. And that was such a it was such a gift. It was such a revelation, especially having previously been in a position where I was basically invisible, even though I was supposed to be in charge of the show. And that's not what this was like at all. And it was really, you know, Malcolm was so generous with his compliments, and he would say, this episode started out as a B-, and because of you, it's an A. And I would basically like
Eh,
give it, and that's listening to a first draft and saying like, this scene isn't working. I'm not understanding what you're saying. I'm not feeling it. This character isn't coming through. I don't get it. Saying stuff like that, and it sort of occurred to me that when you reach the level of fame that Malcolm has, not everyone tells you the truth. A lot of people tell you what you want to hear.
sure.
And I didn't do that. And from the beginning, I like wasn't in the mood, and I didn't do it. And it really, it was just really wonderful. It was wonderful to be heard in that way. And I also really listened to him. He was pulling some really unique moves in audio that, hadn't been done before. Like, I was always trained that like audio has to be linear, right? Because you don't have those visuals, you have to tell a story in this very linear fashion. And he was like, I'm going to start the story here, and then I'm going to go into the past, and I'm going to tell a story over here, and then I'm going to jump over here, and then I'm going to come back here.
Oh
And me and my
no.
editor, Julia Barton, would be like, oh, I don't know, is this going to work? And it did work, and it was
Oh,
really amazing. So I listened to his sort of unique take on how our audio storytelling could go, and he listened to my feedback, and it created this wonderful team. It was really great.
awesome. That's so awesome.
But it did start out with not, me worrying about people not listening.
Right, 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 right. Then
And
that's
people
what I
did
was
listen. It did. The show became really, really big, and lots of people listened then and still listen now.
right, right. And by putting down your foot in the very beginning, you gained a lot of respect from him. I think that that's how it started, right?
Yeah, I totally unexpectedly, yes. I did not think that's what would happen. But yes, that is what happened. And I'm so grateful to him and for that whole experience.
Well, not only that, that led to, what was it, 28 podcasts with Pushkin Industries. His
Yes, it led to this, because we had such a good trusting relationship. He brought me along. Revisionist History started at this company called Panoply Media. And when that company shifted gears, they didn't want to make content anymore. Malcolm and his friend Jacob Weisberg started another company called Pushkin Industries, and they asked me to come along and run production on that show. And by the time I left that job 4 years later, we had 28 or something podcasts that
Right.
I was responsible for all of them, which
Oh
was
my
a
god.
lot.
Just being responsible for one is a lot for me, but
Yes. I wasn't doing the hands-on work I really only kept the hands-on work on revisionist history, and then I
right.
even had to let that one go.
Oh,
But I was ultimately responsible for making sure they got done by this incredible team of people that we hired. So
sure, sure. Well, yeah, I can imagine that you couldn't be in the trenches with every single podcast.
I could not. I could not.
That's
But I
not
miss
possible.
listening. I mean, just speaking about listening, since I my listening became much more surface. I really would just do sort of a quick sort of scan to make sure that the shows, for a lot of the shows that I was responsible for, I would just give it a quick listen. Like, are there any red flags? Is there anything, really noticeably wrong with this? If not, great, get it out there. And I didn't love that. It felt really surface. It's different. I like the really intense listening, even if I'm not the one making the audio, like doing the working in Pro Tools and doing the hands-on production. I still like doing a really deep listen where I'm really getting into the story. And I missed that. I missed when I was responsible for so much. I really missed getting to do listening at that deep level.
Well, yeah. Yeah, because it feels satisfying.
Yeah. Yeah, as opposed to just sort of checking a box, like, okay, yes,
Right.
this is fine. What can I like, as opposed to like, okay, where am I moved? Where am I losing focus?
Right.
Where am I feeling different things? And how does that, I just didn't, it takes time and it takes more than one listen to really get that.
But
Um,
but also it takes emotion
mm,
and and investing the energy into the emotion of listening to something that's deep.
Absolutely. And focus, right? And
Right.
when you have a million things to do, it's really hard to get that focus.
Yeah. Yeah, and when you have a million things to do, it's hard to assign s some kind of emotional content because it takes you away from your checkoff list.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. So I'm
Right.
trying to get back to that, right? The work I'm trying to do now is a lot more, requires more of that focus, fewer projects,
Nice.
more, deeper projects, that kind of thing.
Right, right, and I know that your, interest is in storytelling, and this sort of underscores how important storytelling is.
Hmm.
And we should get away from Malcolm Gladwell because you've spent a lot of time, of course, working with him. But there are some other storytellers that you have mentioned that you've worked with. You actually mentioned you've worked with some of the best storytellers in the planet.
It's true. Been very lucky.
Wow, wow. So tell me a little bit about that.
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, right now I'm working with a journalist named Jane Perlez, and she's the former Beijing bureau chief for the New York Times, and she now I helped her create this podcast called Face Off: The U.S. versus China, and I love working with her to tell stories because it's not an it's you know narrative stories are very expensive to make, and a lot of people don't have the budget for that sort of thing. And so I'm working with her, or I worked with her last year to develop this show that feels narrative, but is a lot. It's more interview based, right? Like we basically created this format where we have a very short narrative top of the show. And then she does an interview, and then there's a little analysis at the end with another friend of hers, this esteemed historian, Rana Mitter. And the top part of every episode, we try to get her to tell a story, a personal story, because she has been everywhere. She knows everyone. She's such
Ooh.
a just incredible. She's a very reluctant storyteller. She likes she's a journalist. I always tell her she's a capital J journalist, right? New York Times, like she doesn't like to talk about herself. She likes to give the information, but in a podcast you really do need to have that personal connection. And so my
Sure.
producer Nina Porzuki and I have really been encouraging her to share more of herself. And my favorite episodes are the ones where she really just goes into it. So we did an episode last season about nuclear weapons. It's such an intense topic, really challenging material. But at the top of the episode, she talked about this movie that she loved when she was a kid called On the Beach. It was an Oscar winning movie with Fred Astaire and uh, oh, I'm blanking on who else was in it, but it was just this incredible movie. And she talked about, and it took place in Australia, and she's from Australia. And she told the story of going to see this movie when she was a kid. And it was just, and we used music, of course, we used a little bit of music from the movie, but we also have a composer who is creating some music for us and doing the sound design. And it just had this beautiful entryway into such a difficult topic in a way that I think makes it so much more compelling and palatable as a story. And then she interviews this, really interesting person, and she goes on and does her analysis after that. But that narrative storytelling top is just my favorite part. And I think she really likes it too. I think she, even though she's a bit reluctant to talk about herself, I think she does like how it comes out in the end. And so we're trying to get her, in season 2, we're trying to find any little moment that she can like share an aspect of her own personal experience. Um, so that's somebody, that's something that I'm doing more recently.
Well, everybody has a wealth of experiences, but rarely are they asked to tell their stories to a broad public. So every once in a while it'll come back out as a part of a conversational point when you're talking to a friend or something. Oh, well, when I was like in this scenario, it popped up, and it's kind of interesting when you give somebody else the microphone and you say, "Tell me your story." There is a shyness that begins. It's
Yeah, and we've tried to do it in lots of different ways. My producer Nina is just really great at getting Jane to relax, and so she'll actually interview her instead of saying, "Okay, tell me this story." Right? She'll just get her talking, and then sometimes that'll work by itself. Like we can just use that tape, and we'll just let the casual the actual telling of the story to Nina as the sound. Other times we have to finesse it and write it out, and then record it more like a you know like narration. So
right.
depending on how to do that, but yeah, it is. I mean, it is a scary thing. I mean, it's often why I'm on the other side of the mic and not on this side of the mic. It's much easier to be the one. I think it's easier to be the one asking the questions than answering them. Um, but
Well,
it is a yeah.
yeah, yeah. But coming back to the original point, which is that people have this wealth of experiences, and they're in general they're not accustomed to telling their stories unless they're put on point. And then, of course, there's that moment of discomfort of, oh, my story is interesting, or how do I tell this story? Or I mean, for me, there's all these little question marks that pop up, and then you can't wait too long before you tell the story, so something comes out of your mouth.
Right, right. There's a great, I've another incredible local talent. Suzanne Snyder does or she teaches oral history, and I took one of her classes, and she does this exercise where you just have to sit in silence we did it for 5 minutes, sitting with a partner and just sitting in silence for 5 minutes and nobody filling the space, and it was one of the most difficult things that I've ever done in a sort of a journalistic context. And the lesson there is that when you are sitting across from someone and really listening, it's a silent act,
Yes.
right? And just letting that space exist and just sitting and listening to the silence and like you can really get so much out of it, and it was shocking. It was kind of revelatory to me, and I'm a space filler. I'm totally, if you leave a silence, like I will talk. You can tell, I just, even if I don't have anything to say, like I will fill that silence. And so when I'm doing the interviewing, I really try hard to leave space. I mean, it'll never be as long as 5 minutes, but I try to remember that exercise, and I try to really control myself and ask a question and then just sit. And after, actually, in journalism classes, they teach you, like, after someone is done speaking, be silent for another, I don't know how long, 5, 10 seconds, and just see if they're really done or if there's more. Or if you ask a question to like a class and nobody says anything right away, just sit. And somebody will speak eventually, but it's hard. It's really, really hard to do. For me anyway, to just sit in silence.
Well, there's also I think about the fact of sitting in a school scenario. There's a moment when you have to sort of allow the question to percolate, and then the process of composing an answer might or might not come out quickly. So there's that process that each individual has to go through to sort of compose their thoughts and compose what they want to say.
Yeah. And it's funny, I've actually used Zoom, like the tools that Zoom offers as a way to help practice this because I'm so inclined to jump right in and not let the question kind of percolate and give people time. And so I will actively mute myself. Like if I'm when I'm in the teacher role, I will ask a question and then I will just mute myself.
Ooh.
And seeing that light, like the little light comes on, right? So it's like a reminder, like, don't, nope, it's not your turn anymore. It's their turn. So that helps me, even if I wanted to talk, they're not going to hear me. So it's actually just been kind of an interesting um, self-reflective practice that I've developed for myself when I'm trying to not fill space. Um, but you're right. I mean, they need time, and it can feel it can feel awkward, but I think it's really, really important.
I was also thinking about your listening process when you listen to podcasts. And you had told me a story about how you listen to your podcasts, not in the general focusing on all the details, but from the very, very beginning. You had said to me that you like to take a podcast out for a walk. Tell me about walking with your podcast.
It's so I do. I say I like I am a much better listener when I'm moving. So, and I don't know why. There's probably some physiological reason for that. I really don't know. But the reason I started doing that is because when I was again making revisionist history, I spent so much time sitting at my computer doing the hands-on. It would be hours and hours and hours of this like really intense, head like the big headphones on, um, like just listening to every little detail, every little detail. And when I was done, I needed to step away. I needed to literally get up, take my headphones off and walk away from it. And I needed time. And that to kind of forget about all that kind of detailed work. And then when I was ready to see how I did, and like I said, I was often doing this in the middle of the night, and I would get into this kind of dream state. It was fascinating. But I needed to listen in a completely different way to see how if my work was landing. And so I would just take it for a walk. I would just put in my earbuds. I wouldn't wear my big cans. I would like put in my earbuds and I would go outside and just walk with it. And I wouldn't take notes. I wouldn't I actually usually would take a notebook with me in case I heard something that I knew I needed to fix. But I tried not to do because I didn't want to lose the time code. I just had to like write down where it was. But I would try not to do that. I would try to just walk and let it wash over me and all the distractions, dogs walking by and people mowing their lawns. And, I live in the country. So these are the kinds of things we hear, not a lot of traffic noise, birds chirping, just like the natural distracting sounds. And it helped me hear the piece at a completely different level. And it worked so well to let me, one, not focus on the too many tiny little details that regular listeners would never hear. I sort of joke with my team that like, because I would ask for changes that like no regular human would ever notice. Like, oh, there was a tiny little mouth click. My colleague Julia Barton has this thing called misophonia, where the sounds of like mouth noise like scream in your head basically. And I don't have it as bad as she does, but I notice stuff, and like nobody else notices that stuff. And so when you're walking outside with distractions, you don't hear that stuff. And so you can really just listen to the story and whether it's landing. And so that's just become a very regular practice for me, whatever I'm working on, to just take it for a walk. That's sort of become my default sort of phrase for when you need to step away from a really kind of detailed listen and just see if it's working big picture. And I love it. It's now my favorite way. When I listen to audiobooks, when I listen to anything, I much prefer to listen while I'm moving. And it gets in my, even if I'm not 100% focused on that sound, it is still touching me in a deeper way because I'm moving my body and because I don't know, I wish I knew the science of it. I wish I understood like what that was, but I feel like it sinks in better when I listen like that. Um, so yeah, that's how I that take it for a walk.
That
Take your podcast for a walk. I actually do it for my students now too. I'm like, when you're done, when you think you're done, take it for a walk and then see if you're really done.
it's such a beautiful image. I just love it.
And it's good for you too. I mean, it's good to, a lot of reporters and producers spend a lot
Right.
of time sitting. So it's good for you to just get up and move yeah, on many levels.
Well, I think that also integrates whatever you're listening into your body as action
Mm.
and somehow initiates it. I don't know, I'm lacking in being able to explain it exactly. I've read a lot about how motion and listening gets integrated into the body and into the mind. And that's about as far as I can go with my explanation.
Something to study, some future study. I like that.
So beautiful. I love that particular arc, and yeah, it's put a little star on it and say in future things to think about.
Well, and I know with dance, you really you're moving to feel and you're feeling the music and it's impacting you. But I think it works with story too. It's just
Oh,
happening on a
sure.
different level.
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, our I think it's our bodies are what, 95% water,
Hmm.
97% water. So any of the vibrations, sonic vibrations, become a part of our body
Hmm.
immediately. So
That's so
there's that
interesting.
part too. There's a physiological impact of vibration. So taking it out of the walking and into the driving. You had mentioned to me, and something I wasn't familiar with was the driveway moment.
That's an old kind of public radio term. I think that was also Ira Glass, if I'm not mistaken, or similar. It was the goal of any producer or storyteller is to one of the things radio's in your car, right? Like that's how people used to listen. Now you can take your podcast anywhere. And the goal, and you're often doing something else while you're listening, right? So the goal that we would talk about is to capture your listener so intensely that they can't get out of their car when they've arrived at their destination. They just have to sit there and finish listening. And that's what we call a driveway moment, where you're just sitting there, seatbelt on, maybe the car is still running, and you just have to finish the story. And we live in such sort of distracted worlds, there's so much going on all the time. And so if a story really can do that for you, if you like, and the other one is like, you forget the dish in your hand, right? Like if you're washing dishes, right? Like you don't want the pile of dishes to end because you want to keep listening. That's sort of a definition of success. Or you don't mind your workout, right? Like these are things like we talk about, like a great podcast is the length of a workout or the length of a pile of dishes or whatever, the length of a load of laundry folding. And this sense of like not wanting these mundane tasks to end because the story is so good. You just want it, you want to finish it. You don't want to move on to the next thing. So that's what that term excuse me, that's what that term is about. It's been around for a very long time, but I kind of love it, and it still applies.
Right, right, absolutely. It was new to me, but I'm always wanting the mundane tasks to be over long before I start them. So looking forward to them is kind of an interesting thing to think about in listening to podcasts. I'm going to have to try that because I had allowed my laundry to pile up after it was clean. I just couldn't. Somehow getting around to the folding and the putting it away is just so mundane. It drives me crazy. I don't have that much, right? It's really easy. And I was thinking yesterday or when I was doing it that I thought, well, if I were to time this, I bet you this takes me only what 3 to 5 minutes to put it. And no, I don't fold my underwear. No, I just glob it and throw it into the drawer. So, that simplifies things a lot. But still, the idea of listening to something else besides my brain, whining about how boring folding laundry is, I could easily distract myself, by something else. And I'm going to have to try that.
Well, and you also then get that, since you are moving, right? You have that other task, so that's taking up that part of your brain, and then you have different space available for listening. I've also taken this is I don't know, this might be a little weird, but I've taken to if I can't be out walking, so in the winter especially, to doing puzzles while I listen. And it just takes up one sort of very distracted part of my brain so that I can listen more fully with that other part of my brain. And I'm sure there is some scientific explanation for this, but it allows me to listen better when I have some. I know some people knit while they're listening. I'm not a knitter, but um, I've found puzzles to be a great way to just like
Wow.
take up that thing that like if I just tried to sit down and listen, I could not do it. My brain just like goes
It
in a
is,
million directions. I cannot do it.
right. Right. It
So
incorporates motion.
yeah, yeah. So puzzles are a good one if I can't be outside.
And that reminds me of the fact that when I'm on a long telephone conversation, what I inevitably do is walk into the kitchen and do something in the kitchen.
Mm.
Either prepare a meal or wash the dishes or something, clean the surfaces or something, make myself a cup of coffee. All that motion seems it will inevitably happen, and I'll eventually have to apologize, say, Excuse me, I have to move while I'm talking because I have to." So, if you hear the dishes being washed, it's not because I'm bored with your conversation, it's actually because I'm concentrating on it, but I have to move my body.
Yeah, yes, yeah, exactly.
So, yeah, I guess it comes back to, taking the podcast out for a walk or taking the conversation out for a walk.
Exactly, exactly. I love to walk and talk. I used to say when I was doing a lot of management, I would, my favorite kind of conversations were the ones where we would both, and I did a lot of my management work when I was during COVID, so none of us we couldn't be together, but we would both take our calls for a walk, and that's when we would do our check-ins and see how everyone's doing, and it was like this nice little point of connection. What are you looking at right now? Where are you? What's the weather where you are, kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah, and, every once in a while, I think, well, instead of having a meeting in an office, we should take it out to the park. Let's
Exactly.
let's have a meeting while walking around the river.
Exactly. So much nicer. So much nicer,
Yeah.
especially if you have to talk about something kind of difficult. I
Right.
think it's just and actually it just reminded me the Kitchen Sisters are these incredible longtime storytellers, and they would talk about the best interviews being when you're sitting side by side, so like and not face to face, right? So that you can that some people get very intimidated by face to face conversation, and they're not as able to open up. So if you sit side by side like you're in a car, like you're
Oh,
driving in a car, you can
sure.
and like having a conversation that way, you can really get much deeper into the conversation. And so when they set up interviews, you don't want all the distracting outdoor sound when you're trying to get a pristine interview, but they would sit side by side and they would hold the microphone like this. You can't see this in a
Nice.
podcast, but like in front of them, and they would tip it to the side, instead of forward and back. It would be side to side, and in that way, they were able to help some of the people they were interviewing relax more into the conversation. And I just love that. And that's what happens when you're walking with somebody, right? You have to look straight ahead so you don't bump into anything,
Oh, yeah.
and you feel their presence. You're still together. You're still, it's still a very intimate thing, but you don't have that sort of intense eye contact that can be very intimidating sometimes. And so if you're having a difficult conversation, I think it can be a really nice way to sort of um, loosen the tension a little bit.
Oh, how beautiful. I'm just sort of reimagining walking in the park with somebody and having that conversation. Yeah, it seems obviously easier. And it's not clear why, but another research topic.
Yes, I know.
Well, Mia, we've come close to the end of our time together. Is there anything else you would like to add to this podcast? Is there anything particular that you wanted to talk about or that you're involved with right now?
I don't think so. I mean, I really love this opportunity to, like I said, I listen for a living. It is my job. And I really appreciate this opportunity to think about listening on a deeper level, on a more sort of philosophical level. And I appreciate your having me on to talk about this stuff. Thank you.
Well, it's really been great, and I love your viewpoint and your referencings. And I'm looking forward to running into you in the neighborhood because I think we live relatively close. So one day we'll have to do coffee.
Yes, and walk and talk. We can walk and talk and have
Yeah,
coffee.
with our mugs in hand.
Exactly.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate this.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning into this episode of Listening with China Blue. I hope it inspires you to build your own listening practice. This begins as a daily practice of attentively listening without judgment. And you can ask yourself, what is your own version of silence? The music for this podcast is from China Blue's Saturn Walk, co-composed with Lance Massey, the creator of the T-Mobile ringtone. If you want to learn more about me and my work, go to chinablueart.com. And also, please follow me on Facebook at china.blue.art, at Instagram at china_blue_art, and on X at China Blue Art.